Signore e signori, buonasera. Grazie di essere qui. Farò una breve introduzione in italiano e poi lascerò la parola al nostro ospite. Ci farà la sua relazione in inglese. È un grande piacere avere ospite con noi il dottor Bussmann, che ha studiato studi del vicino Oriente e teologia all'Università di Heidelberg, ha poi ricevuto il suo PhD dalla Freie Universität a Berlino nel 2007, con una tesi su i templi di età predinastica, di prima età dinastica nell'antico Egitto. Dal 2010 al 2016 ha insegnato egittologia e archeologia egiziana all'University College di Londra e dal 2016 è professore di egittologia all'Università di Cologne. Quello di cui ci parlerà stasera è particolarmente interessante, ovvero si concentrerà su come le microstorie o le storie che si possono definire in piccole comunità poi possono avere una ridondanza o rispecchiare i grandi avvenimenti macrostorici che invece avvengono. In particolar modo commenterà sullo sviluppo di piccoli santuari nelle comunità locali per discutere quale fosse la relazione fra l'autorità centrale e i piccoli mondo locali, e al contempo farà questo presentandoci alcune informazioni della sua attività archeologica ad Ebenu, e combinando quindi informazioni archeologiche con informazioni di storia sociale e soprattutto con queste due prospettive. E infatti la sua lecture si intitola Small Places, Big Issues, Local Life in Ancient Egypt. Thank you for being here. Sorry for introducing you in Italian, so I give you the word, and we're very curious to hear how microhistory might have a relationship with big history and big issues in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, first of all, to the Museo Egizio for this invitation. Thank you very much for your introduction, Professor Greco. It's a great honor to be here and a great pleasure. The collection of this museum is of utmost importance for everybody who is interested in the Old Kingdom and in provincial life in ancient Egypt. And this is very much also the context for my lecture tonight. So small places, large issues, local worlds in ancient Egypt has a lot to do with how Egypt looked like beyond the big religious and political centers. Okay. Can you hear me and follow me? Okay, great. One of the directors of this museum, Ernesto Schiaparelli, has excavated at many sites that are relevant for this talk. I'm going to show a few slides that feature also his findings. He's been one of those scholars approximately 100 years ago who were interested in provincial Egypt. These would also include Guy Brunton, for example, who worked at Kaul Kebir, or George Reisner, who worked at Naga Adair. So interest in provincial Egypt dates back to 100 years ago, but it's only over the past 30 years or so advanced models for the interpretation of provincial society and culture of ancient Egypt have emerged. One idea is that there is in fact not one ancient Egypt, but there are many, depending on with whose eyes I just wait for the technical support. Okay. Good. So, there is not one ancient Egypt, but that there are many, depending on with whose eyes we are looking. So there is an Egypt that was experienced by kings and courtiers, but this probably looked very different from the ancient Egypt of local governors, and this again was certainly different from the Egypt of villagers and commoners and peasants. So the perspective I'd like to take tonight is the perspective of local communities. Conceptually or theoretically, if you want, my presentation is inspired by research from within Egyptology as much as from outside, and I put up two titles here that reflect this inspiration. On the left-hand side, you see the book by Thomas Eriksson, Small Places, Large Issues. Basically, of course, this is the quote of my talk. And this is an introduction to social and cultural anthropology. One of the major ideas of this book is that all big ideas, kingship, religion, theology, administration, symbolism, and all these things need to be looked at from a local perspective in order to understand how they were rooted in the daily lives of people. So the question here is, what does kingship, for example, mean for an ancient Egyptian villager? How were big ideas such as the belief in Osiris or so, how were they appropriated by people? How were they negotiated at a local level? How did people appropriate certain elements of big ideas? So it's very much looking at practices that helps us understand the relevance of big ideas in local worlds. Another inspiration comes from what is now called New Cultural History, and it's a pleasure to quote here Carlo Ginzburg, who was born in Turin, and he's one of the major representatives of this strand of research in history. His book Il formaggio e I vermi is about a miller called Menocchio, who lived in the 16th century. It's very interesting. This miller came in conflict with the Inquisition in his village. Perhaps some of you know the book. It's very interesting, very nicely written also. And it turns out during the trial against Menocchio, who lost, in this trial, he came up with a whole variety of different ideas about what Trinity means, what the soul is as opposed to the Holy Spirit. So all of these are big ideas, large issues of the time, and it's quite surprising, probably also exceptional in this case, to understand how these big ideas were appropriated by this miller. So you see here the same idea between these books, although they draw from rather different types of evidence. So anthropology deals with recent communities, so modern communities living today, and historians deal usually with pictorial or written evidence. What I'd like to do tonight in my lecture is to see how we can make these ideas work in the ancient Egyptian context using archaeological evidence in the first place. Chronologically, very broadly speaking, I'm concentrating on this yellow strip. That is the pre-dynastic and pharaonic period, 4300 to 30 BC. More specifically, within this yellow strip, this is the classical period of Egyptian archaeology. Of course, there's a very long, exciting prehistory and a very exciting time after pharaonic Egypt. And these are also periods that Egyptian archaeology is now exploring. But classically, Egyptian archaeology concentrates on the yellow strip. And within this, my focus is going to be on the third millennium, that is 3000 to 2000 BC approximately. My lecture is structured in three parts. In the first part, I'm going to introduce a large issue. That is the monumental temple tradition and kingship in Egypt. In the second part, I'd like to look more closely at how these big ideas play out in local contexts. And I'm going to focus on the community shrines of the third millennium. And in the final part, I'd like to take you to the site where I have recently started doing fieldwork at. And I'd like to show how the ideas of microhistory and macrohistory, what this might have to do with fresh fieldwork in Egypt today. Right, so let's have a look at a large issue, temple tradition and royal display in Egypt. To start from the end of this history, this is an image of the Temple of Edfu, dedicated to the god Horus. I assume that some of you know this temple because it's open for tourists. So temples in this period certainly are the central institutions of Egyptian society. It's not only because they are monumental. The temple of Edfu is quite exceptional. There are other temples that are smaller, but still, overall, there are a whole series of big temples spotted along the Nile. This is very much also the encounter of ancient Europe. That means Herodotus, for example. This is how Egypt looked for them. That's their ancient Egypt. But that's just a footnote. So we see here a monumental temple. So also these temples were economically and socially the major interfaces between central administration and local communities. If we zoom in on the temple decoration, you probably know that the ancient Egyptian temples are decorated over and over again with the same types of scenes. That is the king making offerings to the gods. That's very different from Roman and Greek temples where there is a stronger emphasis on myth, but in Egypt it's ritual. So, and the inscriptions are also revealing because they interpret what is being depicted here. And the offerings are interpreted as the eye of Horus that the king returns to the deities. According to Egyptian belief and the Osiris myth, this is an image that means that the order is being re-established and the cosmos is maintained. So it's basically kingship and only kingship that is able to maintain the cosmos. And the deities, they transfer kingship to the gods. Again, this is clear from the inscriptions. Of course, the ideas are developed and are much more complex than here, but in essence, I think this can be defined as what matters about Egyptian temple cult. So the message here is basically it's an explanation of the relevance of kingship because only the kings are able to maintain the cosmos. So apart from economy and society, it's also ideology in the broadest sense that shows that these temples are major arenas of royal display. This tradition can be traced back to the New Kingdom. So one example is the Luxor Temple. Again, many of you will know this temple. Again, probably it's a rather exceptional temple theologically, and also Thebes is a bit special. There are minor temples also in this period, but again in the New Kingdom, similar to 1,000 years later, there are quite a lot of monumental temples scattered throughout Egypt. It's a little bit more difficult in the Middle Kingdom. In the Middle Kingdom, we do have similar evidence, but temples are a little bit smaller. It's just because most of these temples were dismantled and the blocks were reused for New Kingdom buildings that it is a little bit more difficult to show a slide. However, in the Old Kingdom, in the 3rd millennium, the picture is entirely different. There are a few interesting sites, and one of them is Heliopolis, which was excavated by Schiaparelli. And Schiaparelli found the fragments of a little shrine. Some of the fragments shown here are on display in the entrance room of the museum. And we do find here a similar idea to what we've just seen, namely deities being seated, and in the speeches of the deities, they transfer a couple of royal regalia and prerogatives to the king, who is depicted seated in front of the deities. And another site in this context is Gebelein. Again, Turin is lucky, I suppose, to have one of these two fragments excavated and one of them is in Cairo, one of them is in Turin. On the left, you can see the king striding and a few other individuals accompanying the king, the court society probably. So here the context is a little bit more difficult to reconstruct, but we could assume that there was some kind of temple or shrine in Gebelein. Now, while this might hint at a tradition, a monumental temple tradition, to extend back right to the beginning of pharaonic histories, we should keep in mind that these are exceptions. There is no other site in Egypt apart from Heliopolis and Gebelein where we find such monumental decorated pieces. You could argue that this simply is a chance of survival, so if we just excavate a little bit more, the monumental temples of the early dynastic period would come to light, and exactly this argument has been made in the research literature. But I think that this argument ignores another fact, namely that kingship developed initially in an entirely different context, not in a temple context, but this is how early kingship in Egypt looks like. So kingship was developed in the funerary mode. Again, we see here an exception, the very huge pyramids of Giza in later dynasties, in the later dynasties of the Old Kingdom. The pyramids are a little bit more human scale. So this is basically the primary mode of royal display in the Old Kingdom. It's very different from later periods. Also, iconographically, something different is displayed in the mortuary temples attached to the pyramids. It is not the king making offerings to the deities, but it's the king receiving offerings from various officials of the country. So while this is a reconstruction, there are good reasons to follow this reconstruction. The king is seated before an offering table, and then to the right you see various offering bearers. The message that emerges from this decoration from the pyramid temples is that it's the royal mortuary cult that brings the country together. So it is not the temple cults, but it's the royal mortuary cult, which is the motor, the engine of the economy of the Old Kingdom. So to sum up this first part of my presentation, we see here a rather dramatic change of royal display, funerary cult in the Old Kingdom, and temple cult in the later periods. One of the questions we can raise now is what happens then to the temples of the Old Kingdom? So in the age of the pyramids, how do the temples of the country look like? And this brings me to the second part of my lecture, small places, the local community shrines of the Old Kingdom. I'm going to focus on 3 sites, Abydos, Hierakonpolis, and Elephantine. There are more sites that have been excavated and that have evidence of these community shrines, also in the Delta, Tel El-Fahar, Tel Ibrahim Awad. There are a few other sites. But for the argument that I'd like to make here, I'm going to concentrate on these 3 sites only. To start at Elephantine Island, this is located opposite modern Aswan. Elephantine, as many of you know, is an island in the River Nile. And on this image from Google Earth, you see that today the southern part, the southern tip of the island, which is the archaeological zone, is dominated by a monumental temple dedicated to the god Khnum. If we have a look at the development of this site through time, this is what we see. On the right-hand side, this is the Ptolemaic and Roman period, which looks very similar to the modern situation. So the site was dominated by the Temple of Khnum, and to the right there is a little bit the smaller temple dedicated to the goddess Satit. In the New Kingdom, on the right-hand side of the slide, The temples are a little bit smaller. They're still quite monumental, but you see a few more mud brick buildings on the island. Then again, going back in time, in the Middle Kingdom, on the left-hand side, the Temple of Khnum has disappeared completely, and the Temple of Startet, number 1, also is much smaller than in the New Kingdom. And then if you go back to the Old Kingdom, again the situation looks different. It's at number 1 that you see a small hut, a small shrine of Startet, and there is no trace of a Temple of Khnum at all. To a certain extent, this is because the monumental laid Temple of Khnum cannot be dismantled completely, so there might be something below the Temple of Khnum, but the development of the Temple of Startet is quite significant. Before I show you a slide, just to sum up this very interesting slide, Elephantine is one of the very few sites where we can trace the unfolding of the monumental temple tradition through settlement archaeology. We really see here from one step to the next how monumental temples are implemented in this community and how the settlement reacts. The development of the Temple of Startet is quite famous now in Egyptology. So it starts at the top in the 3rd millennium. It starts with a rather small mud brick shrine. And then, step by step, this temple becomes more and more monumental. So in the Middle Kingdom, this is the reconstructed temple of St. Rostat I. And at the bottom on the photo, you see the temple of the New Kingdom. And the Ptolemaic temple, again, is a little bit grander than the New Kingdom temple, but only the foundations of the Ptolemaic temple are preserved. So archaeologically, we can see here how this monumental temple tradition is born out of a small community shrine. Sociologically, this process has been described as the penetration of kingship into the local temple. Now let's have a look at the temple before the advent of kingship in the 3rd millennium. This is how the shrine looks like. We are basically talking here about a shrine attached to a natural rock niche. The shrine is small, it's about 5 to 8 meters in size. And the excavator calls the front part the forecourt and the rear part the sanctuary. In the forecourt, you see the entrance door. In the middle of the forecourt, you see a square mud brick structure. This has been interpreted as an altar, so a place where perhaps offerings were brought. And you also see in the corner, you see a garbage pit, and fish bones were found in this, so probably there was quite a strong smell in this temple. There's also a trough, a large pot for water in the forecourt, and there are also 8 wooden posts, which 4 of which are attached to the mud brick square in the center, and there are another 2 pairs. There are another 2 pairs. 1 pair is over here, and 1 pair is over here. These were built a little bit later than the mud brick structure. I'm going to explain the relevance of this observation in a minute. So on the plan, this is how the temple looks like. Again, we have here the enclosure wall of the forecourt, the square mud brick structure. You see here the 8 wooden posts lined up. And the sanctuary itself was disturbed by later layers, but some parts have remained. So there are a few wooden planks here on the ground, some pottery vessels. So we can start piecing together some ritual activities that took place in the sanctuary. Perhaps some water was poured out. This is what we call a libation offering. Perhaps a little shrine was set up, but this is not entirely clear. And also you see a secondary niche over here. This has been interpreted as the very beginning of the temple of Khnum. So perhaps Startet was venerated in this main sanctuary, and Khnum, who later was the main deity of Elephantine, originally perhaps was dedicated in this subsidiary chapel. There are hardly any inscriptions or imagery similar to the temples that similar to the later temples that we've seen at the beginning of my talk. So there's an almost entire absence of kingship in the 3rd millennium. However, archaeologically, the temple was extremely rich. Many votive objects were found in the temple, and these include faience figurines of different shapes, for example, human beings, a baboon, a frog, a crocodile, a hippopotamus, and other objects. These also include personal jewelry, which was probably worn during lifetimes, and very simple flint knolls. So these are stones that were picked up from the ground. They don't require any technology or any money, basically. So this probably are votive objects of the less wealthy at Elephantine. Only towards the end of the Old Kingdom we see the first royal objects from this temple, and these take the shape of these faience plaques with royal inscriptions. This is a plaque by Pepi I, for example. So it's only in the late Old Kingdom that kings start to recognize the relevance of this temple for the local community. Another important piece is this very interesting naos. The naos is inscribed with the name of Pepi I, and it was secondarily inscribed by his successor, Meron Re. And probably the niche served for a statue. This temple was not found in the temple. It was secondarily used in a different building. So it's not entirely clear whether the naos really belongs into the early temple. But the usual assumption is that it did, partially because Pepi I is called here beloved of Startet. There is some discussion about how we reconstruct this first monumental royal piece in the early shrine. The relevance of the question is, that we need to understand how kingship connected and penetrated in these local milieus. How did this work? One reconstruction is the one of the German Archaeological Institute. When you travel to Elephantine, you will find this arrangement here. A replica of the naos is set up in the shrine. So the assumption is that Pepi I dedicated this naos to the worship of Startet. Martin Ziermann reconstructed the temple along these lines. You can see here the so-called altar. Perhaps something was put up on the altar here. These are the water troughs, and there is some kind of linen roof in the forecourt. Another interpretation has been put forward by Barry Kemp. Barry Kemp believes that the temple has two parts. The forecourt, which is what he calls the realm of the revealed image. So one statue of the deity Startet was shown here, and the realm of the hidden image in the sanctuary, which is where the naos of Pepi I was set up. My own reconstruction is a little bit different. So I have proposed that the naos was set up on the square so-called altar in the forecourt, and that it was not dedicated to the deity Startet, but that Pepi I installed a statue cult for himself in the forecourt of this temple. The background for this reconstruction is that we know from inscriptions that in this period, in the 6th dynasties, kings started to erect chapels with their own statues in provincial shrines, so-called car houses. This probably is a reaction to the increasing regionalization of the country towards the late Old Kingdom, so before the First Intermediate Period. So suddenly, let's say, central administration understands the relevance of local temples in the regional centers, and one measure to hold the country together is to increase royal presence in these local temples. So I think that in the case of Elephantine, this is archaeologically the shape this strategy took. It also is about the local architecture, because in the previous reconstructions, what has not been explained is why the wooden posts, so these, have been inserted only later in the stratigraphy. It's very clear from the stratigraphy. So my explanation is that this so-called altar originally was a mud brick pillar and supported a roof. It is only when the naïs of Pepi I arrived that the local community needed to think about how and where to put up this naïs, and they cut down the pillar and instead used these wooden beams to support the roof. So I think this is maybe an explanation of why these wooden posts were inserted only later. When I say roof, I'm not talking about a big stone roof. These wooden posts are only 10 centimeters in diameter, so which is roughly this. The roof that I have in mind is something that you can see in local architecture today. So this is an animal shed, a photo I took in 2006 at Amana. So I believe that the roof of the Temple of Startet looked a little bit more like this. So you have these thin wooden posts and an organic roof which they supported. So the relevance here is of the reconstruction simply a technical exercise. It is about the question which historical patterns we think underpin architecture. So the pattern that I've used is the statue cult of kings in these provincial shrines. And I also try to read a little bit more closely the local architecture. Let's have a look at one final slide for Elephantine. So in the early Middle Kingdom then, we see a stronger royal interest in the temple. Mentuhotep II starts building a temple made of mud bricks and stone reliefs, as you can see here on the slide. Here is a reconstruction of the temple on the island today. And here you can see a stone relief with decoration, and this is how the decoration looks like. This is very explicit in terms of Mentuhotep, the king, being depicted between Mentu, the god of the dynasty, so the god of central authority, and Startet, the local deity on Elephantine Island. So Mentuhotep tries to combine central issues and local issues here. And I think that it's this coalescence of central concerns and local concerns that is the basis for the success of temples in Egypt from the Middle Kingdom onwards. Okay, let's have a look at another example, Abydos. The archaeological zone of Abydos is located here. And again, some of you may have visited Abydos already. This is how an archaeological map of the site looks like. So this is the floodplain that we've just seen, and this is the low desert strip. The most famous touristic destiny is the Temple of Startet I. And the site that we are interested in is Abydos North, where a temple for the god Osiris Khontamenti was built. The Abydos North, this area was excavated by Flinders Petrie 100 years ago, and he discovered a series of rather monumental mud brick walls, some of which are still standing. So this wall, the outer enclosure wall, you would still be able to find today. And inside this enclosure, he found a series of mud brick buildings, here nicely put together and drawn by Barry Kemp. There is some discussion of which of these buildings was a temple and which one was something different, but I believe that Barry Kemp is right, and Petrie also is right, that the temple at the top of the slide is the actual temple, because this is where a concentration of royal objects was found. Note also the various deposits, M69, M64, 65. These are pits where votive objects have been deposited, probably when the temple was crowded with votive objects. These were not simply thrown away, but deposited in these pits. This is how the temple area looks like today, so not much is visible. I think that the Old Kingdom structures are located where this little pond has formed today. Part of my PhD research was to reassemble the objects excavated by Petrie, and the votive objects from Abydos look very similar to those at Elephantine. So again, you find a series of faience figurines, baboons, human-shaped figurines, frogs, crocodiles. The frog here actually is made of limestone, so different types of materials, but there's quite a lot of overlap in terms of shapes and materials with the votive material from Abydos. So again, this is quite an interesting type of material to understand popular religious practices. While there is a lot of overlap with Elephantine for most of the 3rd millennium, Abydos takes a different course in the history in the 6th dynasty. At Abydos, many royal inscribed objects were found. So you can see here the names of Meron-Ra, over here, Meron-Ra, Pepi, either the 1st or the 2nd, then Neferkara, which is Pepi II. And there's also a depiction of somebody who was originally interpreted as a king. Interestingly, also two unpublished fragments came to light during my research. These two fragments, a lintel and another object, and this object actually is quite interesting. This is in Bolton today. This is how it looks like. So when I found this blog, originally I thought this is evidence of a co-regency between these two kings here, Meri-Ra, which is Pepi I, and his successor, Meren-Ra. Here is part of the R, here is an N. So it's a very Egyptological idea to believe that this is a co-regency. And, but the problem with this interpretation is that the hieroglyphs behind the cartouches don't make sense. And after a while, actually, it appeared to me that this piece fits on the paper, fits very nicely to this block that I have highlighted before. And a colleague of mine already mentioned that this probably is not a king, because this individual sniffs a lotus flower, and this is a very typical iconography of women. So this probably was a queen. So bringing all these various types of evidence together, what I think we're dealing with here is a building inscription for a queen who's called Ankh-Enes Meri-Ra. So what is preserved then is this part of the inscription and this part over here. And then here we can picture the queen. What is interesting here is that Petrie also found a decree. And in this decree, there is an order that the statues of Ankh-Enes Meri-Ra, another royal woman, their brother, and a king should receive cults. So we already knew from inscriptions that the royal members of the royal family had a statue cult here at Abydos. So what we see here is archaeological, if you want, archaeological proof of what we knew from the inscriptions. It's interesting to raise the question, why Abydos? And again, we have good inscriptional evidence from the tombs at Abydos that the royal family of the 6th dynasty married into the leading ruling family of Abydos. So again, probably we see here the same strategy that I've talked already about before, because the kings were related to the powerful family at Abydos. For this reason, they also set up statue cults for this family at Abydos. So there is an historical explanation of why Abydos looks different from Elephantine in this period. The third site I'd like to draw your attention to is Hierakonpolis. Hierakonpolis is located opposite El Kab. It's this twin city of El Kab and Hierakonpolis. El Kab, you can see here, over here, this big enclosure wall. And if you then travel with a felucca over the Nile, you then come to this riverbank, and you can then walk to Hierakonpolis. Hierakonpolis today consists of two parts. One is the dynastic town and temple area, and the other is the pre-dynastic area here in the desert, and this is where René Friedman currently excavates predominantly pre-dynastic remains. So I'm going to look at the dynastic temple and town area, which is over here. This is how it looks like today. So again, you do not necessarily see a lot here. There are a few mud brick walls here and there, but it's difficult to bring in line what you see in the publications when you are at the site. There's hardly anything that you can make out on the ground. But this is what the excavators found, first Quibble and Green, and then later an American mission. Quibble and Green excavated the Temple of Horus of Nechen, and also the monumental town enclosure wall, probably of the Old Kingdom. And the Americans later excavated the early dynastic palace gateway. This is how it is interpreted. So we are now interested in the Temple of Horus. And the structures there are a little bit confusing, what is what, and the stratigraphy, I have to say, hasn't been understood very well by the excavators. It probably was quite a difficult and challenging site. So for the early period, you have to remove these structures here. This probably is Middle Kingdom, perhaps even later. This is New Kingdom. What we are interested in is this part here. This is an artificial mound of sand held in place by a stone revetment. And in front of this temple area here, the main deposit was discovered. And of course, part of the main deposit was the Nama palette. The Nama palette is, of course, today in Egyptology is something like the foundation document of Egyptian civilization. But I think it's good to go back to the archaeological context and understand that this is a rather exceptional piece, and nothing of this kind was found anywhere else in Egypt, only at Hierakonpolis. So what we see here for the first time is a monumental representation of the king striking down an enemy. Behind the king, on the left-hand side, you see a sandal bearer, so a courtier, and on the reverse side, or what I would interpret as the reverse side, you see again a series of courtiers accompanying the king, the standard bearers. Apart from the Nama palette, there were a few other royal objects from Hierakonpolis. For example, ceremonial mace heads, huge mace heads of this size, again decorated, not used, they didn't have any practical purpose, but these were decorated in a similar way to the Nama palette. And what is often overlooked is that it's not only these inscribed objects, but it's also the material culture that is outstandingly royal. Look at the vases on the left-hand side. These are huge, so some of them are 1 meter in diameter, and parallels for these kinds of vessels are only found in the tombs of the first and second dynasty, of the royal tombs of the first and second dynasty at Abydos. An absolutely outstanding royal monumental culture that we see here at Hierakonpolis. Nothing of this sort was found at Abydos or Elephantine. It's not only royal objects, but also others that are exceptional. So here are examples of the very beautiful ivory objects from Hierakonpolis, two statuettes on the left-hand side. Look at the eyes. These probably were inlaid, perhaps with lapis lazuli, perhaps with some other kinds of jewels or so. But again, this is quite outstanding. On the left-hand side, this is a knife handle which is decorated. And ivory objects were also found at Abydos and Elephantine and other sites, but much smaller. So it really is the very good technology and also the size of these statues. Some of those are 40 centimeters in height. So imagine how you carve a 40 centimeter large object out of the tooth of an elephant or a hippopotamus. That's quite outstanding. So really, we are looking here at different people making votive offerings to the temple of Horus. There were also hundreds of stone vessels found in this temple. Many of them originally were unpublished. So when I put all these stone vessels together, a very interesting chronological pattern emerged. The stone vessels, all stone vessels, about 300 or so, dated to the late pre-dynastic period. There's not one single sherd that dates to the early dynastic period. So this is the kind of stone vessels that you see on the left at the bottom, or the Old Kingdom. So one example is in the middle at the bottom, or late Old Kingdom stone vessels on the right-hand side. The pottery is not very well published, it's more difficult to access, so the stone vessels played quite an important role for the dating of this temple. So to sum up these results, we see here chronologically a specific hub of votive activity in the late pre-dynastic period. This is approximately the time of King Nama. And sociologically, we also have here an outstanding range of people making offerings. So my overall interpretation is this is the material culture exactly of those people who are depicted on the Nama palette. We see here something of the archaeological reality of the Nama palette. We can do some statistics on the materials from Abydos, Hierakonpolis, and Elephantine. Abydos and Elephantine are fairly similar. Most of the objects are made of faience. There are a few others, a few hard stone and ivory objects and so forth, but compared to Hierakonpolis, they are significantly different. At Hierakonpolis, there are a few faience objects which I haven't shown here, but there's a huge quantity of ivory objects, limestone objects, travertine objects, hard stone objects, even semi-precious stones. So this just shows how exceptional Hierakonpolis is. If we map these differences on a chronological chart, this is what comes out. You see here three different lines. The bottom line is the development of the Temple of Elephantine. So it starts in the early dynastic period, really as a local initiative. This is debated. There are other opinions, but this is my interpretation. It's been a local initiative. There's an absence of kingship. And gradually, over the Old Kingdom, kingship sneaks into the temple. The 6th dynasty, we have seen the nays of Pepi I, and then in the Middle Kingdom, we've seen the stone relief of Mentuhotep II. We see here then the beginning of the monumental temple tradition. The picture for Abydos is more or less the same, with the major difference that in the late Old Kingdom, Abydos is much more prominent in royal building activity for the reasons I have explained. It's because the kings married into the ruling family at Abydos. And Hierakonpolis, again, is different, especially in the very early dynastic, late pre-dynastic, early dynastic period, an outstanding range of objects, entirely different types of people who engage with this temple. This is how it looks like when kings are interested in a temple in this period. For the Old Kingdom, the evidence is a little bit more brittle, and then in the late Old Kingdom, we see again royal activity at Hierakonpolis. But the major point I'd like to make here is the beginning of the temple tradition. Some scholars have argued that the monumental temple tradition that I've shown at the beginning of my lecture dates back to the beginning of pharaonic history. Basically, this means to essentialize what pharaonic culture, high culture, is about, the trias of kings, temple cult, and gods. But I think that this is wrong. Elephantine and Abydos are much more likely how the temple tradition began. Hierakonpolis is an exception. So, yeah, this is my model of temple development in Egypt. In the final part of my lecture, I'd like to show you around the site that I have done research at, or I've just started a fieldwork project. We have come to a halt for a moment, but we hope to resume work soon. And again, this is a provincial site, and similar ideas guide our research here. If I just go back to the previous slide. So the title of this slide is Historicizing the Local Milieu. The local milieu is not just different from high culture and from royal culture. We can also follow locally specific trajectories of historical development. So it's here, this slide basically combines macro history and micro history. So my argument is that we need to write more microhistories to understand how big ideas like temple development which shape they have taken. And this is also what guides our research at Hebenu Zawit Sultan, which is also known as Zawit el-Maytin in the research literature. Hebenu is the ancient Egyptian name. Zawit el-Maytin is the official modern name, Zawit Sultan. This is the way I call the site. This is how the locals call the site. It is located in Middle Egypt, and Hebenu has been the capital of the 16th Upper Egyptian nome for much of pharaonic history. If we have a look at this map from Google Earth, we understand that Hebenu is the pharaonic predecessor, forerunner basically, of the modern provincial capital of El Minya. When exactly and how exactly the transition took place from Hebenu to Minya is a matter of research. So it's one of the questions we'd like to answer, probably about the late Roman period, early Islamic period, but this really is open to research. The site, as you can see on this slide, is located directly next to the River Nile. And this is how the site looks like today. It's a rather extensive site, so it's about 1 or 2 kilometers from north to south and 500 meters from the River Nile up the eastern desert plateau. The Nile, as you know, is constantly migrating. So one of the local guardians told us that the island that you can see on the slide here formed only over the past 50 years. So probably what we're seeing here is only an edge of the ancient settlement. If we go back to the previous slide, I think this makes it clearer. The original settlement probably extended to what today is the western riverbank. And this is how the site looks like. So the main site is crammed today with pottery and mud brick walls. From the air, you can discern a pyramid to the north of the site, a rather monumental enclosure wall, and a series of rock tombs. This is also the area that you can visit at the site today. What we'd like to do is to contextualize these monumental buildings and to understand how they sit in the settlement and landscape of their time. So you can already see here a couple of other sites mentioned on the slides. Many of these we discovered not for the very first time, but just to show how rich this site really is. Let me show you around a little bit. This is a view from the entrance of the site. So you can see here the pyramid, the enclosure wall, and at the high up in the cliffs, a series of rock tombs. One of the rock tombs has been completely published by Alexandre Varil. This is the tomb of Nianach Pepi. It's quite heavily restored today. There are other rock tombs, such as the tomb of Kunes of the 6th dynasty, so the tomb was first recorded by Lepsius in around 850, so 150 years ago, and an Egyptian mission discovered about 20 or 30 years ago that the tomb was reused. So you see these human-shaped pits for human-shaped coffins. And this tomb was also decorated. Parts of the decoration and the inscriptions remains. We know from these inscriptions that we're dealing here with the tombs of the local governors. When Lepsius visited the site, this wall was almost completely preserved. So over the past 150 years, many of these tombs have been quarried away, and we are also interested in the destruction history as much as in the building history of these tombs. At the foot of the tombs, we have a series of mastaba tombs of the secondary elite, the subaltern elites. You can see here on the left-hand side a mastaba superstructure and a shaft. And to the right-hand side, you see part of an offering chapel. Basically, the entire main side is pierced with holes from these shafts. And in one case, much of the tomb and also of the burial shaft has been quarried away, so you can see a burial chamber at the bottom of the shaft. So originally here was a chamber. All of this has been quarried away, and this is the burial chamber. So probably this is similar to what we can expect at the bottom of the other tombs as well. Then going on in time, there is a gap in the evidence during the Middle Kingdom. The New Kingdom returns with temple blocks, so the monumental temple tradition holds sway at Habenu. And we also discovered this column base provisionally. I have to say, most of the dates that I'm suggesting here are rather provisional. So we believe, due to the pottery found scattered around in this area, that this is of New Kingdom date, perhaps part of a temple, perhaps part of an administrative building. We don't know yet. In the New Kingdom, we also know the tombs of the local elite again. This is the Ramesside tomb of Nefersecheru, published by Jürgen Osing. And this is very similar to the Old Kingdom tombs in style. Of course, the contents have changed. We see here many different, the decoration is much more similar to what we see in Thebes of the same time. But basically, this is a continuation of the Old Kingdom tradition of, local governors being buried here at the site. Then, entirely unpublished and hardly mentioned in the research literature is what I believe is a late period cemetery. So you see here stones, a sarcophagus lying on the ground, and in heaps of pottery and other material. The entire site was later built over by a Roman town. So what you see here is Roman cellars. These cellars, these mud brick buildings, were probably in the 19th century, were then later quarried away, and the fertile mud bricks were used as fertilizers on the fields. I mean, you know the story. So what has remained at the site today is only the inventory of the houses that was not, that stayed at the site, and this is pottery in the first place. This is the picture basically that you can see across the site. I don't know yet how we deal with the situation. It's probably not possible to record every individual sherd. We need to think about a strategy in the future. So any ideas are welcome. The enclosure wall turns out to be a rather complex structure, multi-period, multi-phased. What it exactly was, whether it was a town wall, whether it had defensive purposes, we really don't know. We're really at the beginning, how it fits into the development of the settlement. There are some monumental buildings of the Byzantine period, so the dating again rests on the sherds that were found in this building that Bart van Teune discovered on Google Earth. And in the field, we also found plaster, white plaster on the walls. So whatever this building was in this period, there are rather monumental buildings at the site. There were also tombs of the Roman period. Again, I say Roman. This needs to be confirmed by later excavations. So this is one of them, a brick-vaulted tomb chamber. And these appear at various sites, including near the modern Muslim cemetery, for which the site is known. And these tombs stretch under the modern Muslim cemetery, as you can see over here. One of the more recent additions is what probably is a 19th century watchtower built at the top of the site, and behind the watchtower we have a whole series of quarries. These quarries are part of an extensive quarryscape in Middle Egypt, and this is probably also where the blocks of the pyramid at the site were taken from. This is how the pyramid looks like today. A series of these pyramids were found in Egypt. And they all have standard size. The thing that's different here at Zawit el-Meitin, Zawit Sultan, is the later addition, I say later, I suppose it's later, the limestone addition, which you can see running along the base of this pyramid. And Barry Camp worked at the site 15, 20 years ago, and this is his documentation of the pyramid. It's a layered pyramid, and in front of the pyramid, so here you see the pyramid itself, and here at the front of the pyramid, here he discovered some pre-dynastic remains, so which seem to be undisturbed. What it means is that this royal monument was not placed right in the middle of nowhere, but there was already something at this site. So it connects to an existing infrastructure of some sort. Whether or not the pyramid destroyed some cemeteries or settlement contexts is difficult to say. Perhaps the pyramid also stimulated urban growth in this region, but these are all questions that need further research. What we discovered, however, is a series of tombs, shafts, and there was pottery scattered around the mouth of these shafts. And this pottery was not mixed as at other sites at Hebenu, but was rather consistent in terms of chronology. This is early Old Kingdom pottery. So a medum, a so-called medum bowl, a beer jar, and this was then drawn by Sylvie Marchand. Also, this is a rather typical shape of the early Old Kingdom. And again, here are a few beer jars. So what we see here with these shafts is the people who lived and died when the pyramid was built. So these pyramids, the small pyramids of Upper Egypt, they are dated to the early Old Kingdom, and we have here the local context for this pyramid. So the people who lived and died at the same period when the pyramid was in use. So I think there are some avenues here for future research. There's some potential to contextualize how a royal initiative at the site might have changed settlement patterns or impacted local life at Hebenu. And we hope to follow up this research in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your lecture and very stimulating ideas, and especially, well, congratulations on your work and the huge amount of work you have ahead of you. I have just a small question concerning the work you're doing in Hebenu. So are you planning to do, how can you afford such a huge site with different layers? So you would like to concentrate on the area around the pyramids and to study the relationship between, the royal activity of the Old Kingdom and the continuation with the pre-dynastic, or you are aiming at having a general overview, including the huge heaps of sherds you showed us and late Roman and the Roman period, or what might be the Roman period, and of course, I presume concerning that Roman tombs or whatever they are, you are not allowed to work underneath the Muslim cemetery, I presume. So
yes, it's a very good question. We're still in the process of developing a strategy for the site. At the moment, what emerged from our first season is that we probably are going to concentrate on a few smaller areas, such as the pyramid. But of course, there are different scales of analysis. So personally, I am very interested in a regional perspective, and some of this can be done via satellite imagery. But we also try to identify promising sites at Hebenu. Of course, the idea is, if I may say so, to do something similar to what has been done at Elephantine. So a larger scale excavation that takes into consideration all the various periods and to understand the coherence of areas and different layers. But really, it's a question of it's a question of funding, of course. It is a question of what you can do in the field. But of course, yes, the aim is to have this whole integrated picture of the entire site. Drilling, for example, to do some drilling, boring on the west bank might also be one of a strategy to find out the original size of the town. So different ideas at the moment in the air.
Thank you. May I give the words to some other questions or comments?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Sorry. So my question is just, thank you for your lecture. It was very inspiring. You have shown, if I understood you correctly, that at a certain point royal architecture was built into local shrines. But royal architecture also brought a new language with it, which to my, it strikes me as very, as a sort of code. To decode it, you need a certain degree of visual literacy and also a certain degree of reading literacy. So my question is, the local population who was using the local shrines, how was the population involved into the meaning of, how were they able to decode the royal language?
Yeah, that's of course a very interesting and exciting question. I'm thinking about ways of how to approach such a question methodologically. In a present-day context, you could ask villagers. This is, for example, what Mechem Marriott, an anthropologist, did in India in the 1950s. So where something similar happened in the area that he studied to what I've just shown. And it turned out that the villagers had very different ideas and interpreted central initiatives very differently. So they replied, for example, to the question, who is represented with this statue? So this was one of these statues that was carried around in a procession, and they all replied in a very different way. So they, one way of saying it is they didn't know what was happening, but they made sense according to their knowledge of what was happening. For Elephantine and other sites, of course, it's very difficult to give any kind of definite answer just because we don't have the reply. What you could look at is to what extent the new royal imagery, and I entirely agree that it's a new visual literacy that needs to be developed, to what extent this is incorporated in the local imagery. For example, do you find local votives in the shape of royal imagery? That would be one way of approaching it. The answer to this is to a very limited extent, but this could have a variety of different reasons. So, yes, unfortunately not a definite answer, but I think it definitely is worth exploring this and thinking about methods, how to approach this question.
My question is about elites. So you sort of distinguish between royal votive gifts and votive gifts that you labeled as local, so something that can be traced to the local population, and there was no. Which didn't reflect, there was no class hierarchy reflected there, or the notion of elite was not used. But is that because the evidence, there is no evidence for this kind of layering of votive gifts? Is this category relevant at all to your discourse?
So your question is whether we can distinguish votives made by kings, votives made by courtiers, votives made by local elites. Yeah. I think that there is not an immediate relationship between objects and people. So, for example, one of these very simple flint knolls, these stones that you can grab from the ground, we don't know who offered them. So it could have been one of the local governors who made, passing by the temple, who made such a votive offering. But it also is something that a local peasant, for example, could have made. So there is no direct relationship. Also for the royal objects, the first assumption is that kings made royal objects. But in the case of Abydos, for example, some of the stone vessels that I've shown have royal names, and I assume what happens is that these are not direct royal votive offerings, but that these were donated to the local elite first, and they offered them into the temple. So the relationship between objects and people is much less immediate as one might think.
Thank you. Just a question about what do you think was the original context, possible context of the fragment from the early dynastic, from Jebelain? Do you think, there can be a tradition predating the process you mentioned about the king's building in local, in regional sites during the 6th dynasty?
Yes, I've shown here the major pattern that I think emerges. Now we need to zoom in on the details. So Gebelein and Heliopolis are not only exceptional because of the fragments that were found there, but because the deities worshipped there had a very close relationship with kingship from the beginning. That's the sun god, that's Hathor. Same for Hierakonpolis, that's Horus. So it's these deities that form the core part of early kingship, where we see royal building activity for the shrines. This is a point that Stefan Seidelmeier has made. So it's not a complete neglect of temples in the early dynastic period, but it's a very selective way in which kings supported local cults. And this is how we might explain the fragments from Gebelein. I'm not entirely sure. Today I've seen the fragments from Heliopolis here in the museum. So I believe that this shrine perhaps was a meter high or so. I don't know whether there are any estimations. Perhaps there was a statue of the sun god in there. We really don't know. Was it a shrine? Was it a stele? It's difficult to say. Same for the Gebelein fragments. My assumption would be that this was a statue shrine of some sort. But of course, this is guesswork, really. And whether it was a huge monumental temple, which I don't believe was the case, or whether it was perhaps a mud brick temple with some stone fragments, stone elements, lintels, perhaps a shrine, etc. This is basically how I imagine the Temple of Gebelein. The archives might reveal here a different story, so that would be interesting research.
Still have one question, actually two. The first one is concerning the Temple of Startet, your positioning of the naos in the so-called altar. I didn't quite get the connection that you made between the positioning of the naos there, except for what you mentioned, which is very convincing about the stratigraphy of the poles. But the connection that you made with the ka houses being built, of course, in devotion of the ka of the king in provincial areas. So I would like to ask you that again. And then something else concerning Hebenu. You mentioned that the limestone slab base of the pyramid, you said, well, it might be later, but you don't know, so I wanted to ask you whether there is some archaeological evidence of why you make this assumption.
To start with your second question, this assumption originally has been put forward by Günther Dreyer and Werner Kaiser in 1980. The reason is that we know 7 of these small pyramids, and they all have a standard size, which is why they are interpreted as a central initiative, because they look the same at all 7 sides. But it's only here that we have this outer casing. Günther Dreyer and Werner Kaiser just hypothesized that it might be a later addition. Of course, it's very interesting, because one of the questions we are interested in is how long was the pyramid used? So was it used for a very short time? Basically, was it an unsuccessful attempt of central administration to set up a royal presence at the site? Or was it used over a very long time and later was perhaps renovated and restored, and there was a later addition. So this really is, but this, yes, again, it really is an assumption, and we'll see whether perhaps by looking more closely at the building history of the monument that we might find out the exact date of this casing. Also, the surface of the casing, you see traces of a claw, and this is a technique that is not typically used in the Old Kingdom, and this is another reason why it might be later. So what later means, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, Roman period, I don't know, but there are some indications for this assumption. Now, your first question is about the Ka houses of the 6th dynasty. There is a good article recently by Eva Lange, who excavates at Tel Basta, Bubastis in the Delta. Bubastis is the only site where we know for sure a royal car house was erected, a rather monumental one, probably much larger. I believe that the royal car house was much larger than the actual temple of the goddess Startet. We don't know, but from the inscriptions and the lintels, we know that this was a royal car house. And she has brought together all the historical inscriptional sources for royal car houses. So there is evidence also for a royal car house mentioned at El Kab in the local temple. And Achmim is another site. So a couple of sites where we know these royal car houses were built in the temple because the texts say a car house in the temple of so-and-so. And for this reason, I believe, what does it mean? It's in the temple of Startet, for example. So my assumption is, why can't it be in the so-called forecourt, which, as I've shown, it was not a court, it was not open, it was roofed. But I think this is how archaeologically this might look like in the case of Elephantine.
Well, thank you again for your lecture, and
thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you, and good night to everybody.
The argument is that because Egypt became more and more regional, so the regional centers became stronger and stronger, central administration suddenly started to think about how can we connect to these regional centers. And I think what happened is that they looked at what mattered on a local level. If you want to reach the people, where do we have to go? And it's only this